Chapter 10. By the time Kunta sauntered back into his mother's hut that night, he had made sure that everyone in Jafur had seen him in his Dundico. Though he hadn't stopped working all day, he wasn't a bit tired, and he knew he'd never be able to go to sleep at his regular bedtime. Perhaps now that he was a grown-up, Binta would let him stay up later, but soon after Lamin was asleep, the same as always, she sent him to bed, with a reminder to hang up his Dundico. As he turned to go, sulking as conspicuously as he thought he could get away with, Binta called him back, probably to reprimand him for sulking, Kunta thought, or maybe she'd taken pity on him and changed her mind. "Your fa wants to see you in the morning," she said casually. Kunta knew better than to ask why, so just said, "Yes, Mama," and wished her good night. It was just as well he wasn't tired, because he couldn't sleep now anyway, lying under his cowhide coverlet wondering what he had done now that was wrong, as it seemed he did so often. But racking his brain, he couldn't think of a single thing, especially nothing so bad that Binta herself wouldn't have whacked him for it, since a father would involve himself only with something pretty terrible. Finally he gave up worrying and drifted off to sleep. At breakfast the next morning, Kunta was so subdued that he almost forgot the joy of his Dundico, until naked little Lamin happened to brush up against it. Kunta's hand jerked up to shove him away, but a flashing look from Binta prevented that. After eating, Kunta hung around for a while hoping that something more might be said by Binta, but when she acted as if she hadn't even told him anything, he reluctantly left the hut and made his way with slow steps to Omoro's hut, where he stood outside with folded hands. When Omoro emerged and silently handed his son a small new slingshot, Kunta's breath all but stopped. He stood looking down at it, then up at his father, not knowing what to say. "This is yours as one of the second Kafo. Be sure you don't shoot the wrong thing, and that you hit what you shoot at." Kunta just said, "Yes, Fa," still tongue-tied beyond that. "Also, as you are now second Kafo," Omoro went on, "it means you will begin tending goats and going to school. You go goat herding today with Tumani Ture. He and the other older boys will teach you. Heed them well. And tomorrow morning you will go to the schoolyard." Omoro went back into his hut, and Kunta dashed away to the goat pens, where he found his friends Sitafa and the rest of his Kafo, all in their new Dundicos and clutching their new slingshots. Uncles or older brothers having made them for boys whose fathers were dead. The older boys were opening the pens and the bleeding goats were bounding forth, hungry for the day's grazing. Seeing Tumani, who was the first son of the couple who were Omoro's and Binta's best friends, Kunta tried to get near him, but Tumani and his mates were all herding the goats to bump into the smaller boys, who were trying to scramble out of the way. But soon the laughing older boys and the Wuolo dogs had the goats hurrying down the dusty path with Kunta's Kafo running uncertainly behind, clutching their slingshots and trying to brush the dirtied spots off their Dundicos. As familiar with goats as Kunta was, he had never realized how fast they ran. Except for a few walks with his father, he had never been so far beyond the village as the goats were leading them, to a wide grazing area of low brush and grass with the forest on one side and the fields of village farmers on the other. The older boys each nonchalantly set their own herds to grazing in separate grassy spots, while the Wuolo dogs walked about or lay down near the goats. Tumani finally decided to take notice of Kunta tagging along behind him, but he acted as if the smaller boy was some kind of insect. "Do you know the value of a goat?" he asked, and before Kunta could admit he wasn't sure, he said, Well, if you lose one, your father will let you know. And Tumani launched into a lecture of warnings about goat herding. Foremost was that if any boy's attention or laziness let any goat stray away from its herd, no end of horrible things could happen. Pointing toward the forest, Tumani said that, for one thing, living just over there, and often creeping on their bellies through the high grass, were lions and panthers, which, with but a single spring from the grass, could tear a goat apart. But if a boy is close enough, said Tumani, he is tastier than a goat. Noting Kunta's wide eyes with satisfaction, Tumani went on. Even a worse danger than lions and panthers were Tubob and their black slaty helpers, who would crawl through the tall grass to grab people and take them off to a distant place where they were eaten. In his own 5 reigns of goat herding, he said, 9 boys from Jafur had been taken, and many more from neighboring villages. Kunta hadn't known any of the boys who had been lost from Jafur, but he remembered being so scared when he heard about them that for a few days he wouldn't venture more than a stone's throw from his mother's hut. But you're not safe even inside the village gates, said Tumani, seeming to read his thoughts. A man he knew from Jafur, he told Kunta, deprived of everything he owned when a pride of lions killed his entire herd of goats, had been caught with Tubob money soon after the disappearance of 2 third Kafo boys from their own huts one night. He claimed that he had found the money in the forest, but the day before his trial by the Council of Elders, he himself had disappeared. You would have been too young to remember this, said Tumani, but such things still happen, so never get out of sight of somebody you trust, and when you're out here with your goats, never let them go where you might have to chase them into deep bush, or your family may never see you again. As Kunta stood quaking with fear, Tumani added that even if a big cat or a Tubob didn't get him, he could still get into serious trouble if a goat got away from the herd, because a boy could never catch a dodging goat once it got into someone's nearby farm of couscous and ground nuts. And once the boy and his dog were both gone after it, the remaining flock might start running after the strayed one, and hungry goats could ruin a farmer's field quicker even than baboons, antelopes, or wild pigs. By noontime, when Tumani shared the lunch his mother had packed for him and Kunta, the entire new second Kafo had gained a far greater respect for the goats they had been around all of their lives. After eating, some of Tumani's Kafo lounged under small trees nearby, and the rest walked around shooting birds with their students' untried slingshots. While Kunta and his mates struggled to look after the goats, the older boys yelled out cautions and insults, and held their sides with laughter at the younger boys' frantic shoutings and dashings toward any goat that as much as raised its head to look around. When Kunta wasn't running after the goats, he was casting nervous glances toward the forest in case anything was lurking there to eat him. In the mid-afternoon, with the goats nearing their fill of grass, Tumani called Kunta over to him and said sternly, "Do you intend me to collect your wood for you?" Only then did Kunta remember how many times he had seen the goat herds returning in the evening, each of them bearing a headload of light wood for the night fires of the village. With the goats in the forest to keep an eye on, it was all Kunta and his mates could do to run around looking for and picking up light brush and small fallen limbs that had become dry enough to burn well. Kunta piled his wood up into a bundle as large as he thought his head could carry, but Tumani scoffed and threw on a few more sticks. Then Kunta tied a slender green liana vine about the wood, doubtful that he could get it onto his head, let alone all the distance to the village. With the older boys observing, he and his mates somehow managed to hoist their headloads and to begin more or less following the Woolo dogs and the goats, who knew the homeward trail better than their new herdsmen did. Amid the older boys' scornful laughter, Kunta and the others kept grabbing at their headloads to keep them from falling off. The sight of the village had never been prettier to Kunta, who was bone-weary by now, but no sooner had they stepped inside the village gates when the older boys set up a terrific racket, yelling out warnings and instructions, and jumping around so that all of the adults within view and hearing would know that they were doing their job and that their day of training these clumsy younger boys had been a most trying experience for them. Kunta's headload somehow safely reached the yard of Brimasise, the Arafang, whose education of Kunta and his new kafo would begin the next morning. Just after breakfast, the new herdsmen, each with pride, carrying a cottonwood writing slate, a quill, and a section of bamboo cane containing soot to mix with water for ink, trooped anxiously into the schoolyard. Treating them as if they were even more stupid than their goats, the Arafang ordered the boys to sit down. Hardly had he uttered the words when he began laying about among them with his limber stick, sending them scrambling, their first obedience to his command not having come as quickly as he wanted. Scowling, he further warned them that for as long as they would attend his classes, anyone who made so much as a sound, unless asked to speak, would get more of the rod. He brandished it fiercely at them, and be sent home to his parents. And the same would be dealt to any boy who was ever late for his classes, which would be held after the breakfast and again just after their return with the goats. "You are no longer children, and you have responsibilities now," said the Arafang. "See to it that you fulfill them." With these disciplines established, he announced that they would begin the evening's class with his reading certain verses of the Quran, which they would be expected to memorize and recite before proceeding to other things. Then he excused them, as his older students, the former goat herds, began arriving. They looked even more nervous than Kunta's kafo, for this was the day for their final examinations in Quranic recitations and in the writing of Arabic, the results of which would bear heavily upon their being formally advanced into the status of third kafo. That day, all on their own for the first time in their lives, Kunta's kafo managed to get the goats unpenned and trotting in a ragged line along the trail out to the grazing area. For a good while to come, the goats probably got less to eat than usual, as Kunta and his mates chased and yelled at them every time they took a few steps to a new clump of grass. But Kunta felt even more hounded than his herd. Every time he sat down to sort out the meaning of these changes in his life, there seemed to be something he had to do, some place he had to go. What with the goats all day, the Arafang after breakfast and after herding, and then whatever slingshot practice he could fit in before darkness, he could never seem to find the time for any serious thinking anymore.